here. I'm here to talk about my new book, The End of Cuthbert Clise. I've just started 1 minute early because I'm always a little bit anxious about the technology. But if you want to ask me any questions about the book or about writing or about how we're all managing here through the coronavirus pandemic, feel free to put your questions into the comments. Otherwise, my poor husband, who's operating the technology, will have to come up with all the questions by himself, and he's not that good at it. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. You've given me a reason to get out of my tracksuit pants, which I've been wearing basically this whole time, and put on my skinny jeans, which are actually feeling a lot skinnier than what they were pre-pandemic. I think I've indulged in a little panic eating perhaps, but anyway, it's lovely to get a little bit dressed up. Thank you so much to Better Reading. Hi Sandy Offner, thank you, or Sandy Docker I should say, wonderful Australian author, thanks for joining in. Thank you to Better Reading for giving me this opportunity to speak with you all about the book. Obviously, a couple of months ago, I had grand plans to have in-person events. I bought this wonderful 6-foot banner, thinking that I would take it around to libraries and get to meet lots of wonderful readers. That hasn't turned out, but the banner has still come in handy, and I can use it to sort of hide all the mess in our kitchen, so double bonus. Anyway, about the book. So, The End of Cuthbert Clise is a story of food, friendship, and backyard intrigue. It's set, obviously, in Cuthbert Clise, which is a really idyllic street in suburbia, the kind of place where kids go up and down the street on their scooters and all the neighbours get together for barbecues. But into this suburban idyll comes a new neighbour, Charlie Devine, and she is set to rock the neighbourhood and ruffle a few feathers. She's the wife of a very famous online lifestyle guru called the Primal Guy, who's quite an unusual character. Anyway, she really sets the cat amongst the pigeons in this really idyllic suburb. And the story follows 3 neighbours, Cara, Beth and Alex. They're our 3 main protagonists. And they have varying interactions with Charlie, ranging from really bad to not great at all. Those 3 women are at a real crossroads in their lives in various ways. And as the story goes on, their lives really start to change for the worse. And there's some suspicion amongst each one of them that somehow Charlie is sort of at the root of all of their problems, but they're not quite sure why. So in essence, that's the nutshell of the story. The idea for it came to me from a few different sources, as book ideas always do. I think one of the things that really influenced me was that I loved some of those 90s neighbourhood dramas like Melrose Place and Desperate Housewives. I think there's something really great about the concept of just throwing people together in a bit of a hothouse situation. So essentially you've got people who don't necessarily know each other that well, but they've been forced to live side by side. And I suppose you then have a choice. You either can choose to get along, or there's the alternative, which is a bit of what happens in Cuthbert Clise. You see both sides. You see great neighbourhood relationships, and you also see some slightly frosty ones, which I think really does reflect everyone's experience of what it is to have neighbours. You know, you can't live with them, can't live without them, sort of thing. My own personal experiences is that I've had amazing neighbour experiences and some pretty poor ones. So I want to tell you a story about when I moved into the neighbourhood in which I'm living now. We moved here about 12 years ago, and my husband and I got married, had a baby, just got busy with raising our kids. So we weren't necessarily the most friendly or giving neighbours. I think we're a bit, just focusing on this child. Anyway, one Saturday morning, we went around the corner to another neighbour's house, and their house was up for auction. We didn't know these people. We were just going to have a little sticky beak because it was Sydney and it was in sort of the boom, and that's what Sydney people do for fun, I suppose. Anyway, the house itself sold really well for a really high price, and we started wandering back, and this other woman approached us and she said, "Oh, you're so lucky that you missed out on that place. This area has no sense of community whatsoever." Anyway, my husband and I didn't say anything. We just sort of skulked back to our own house with our baby. But back at home, we sort of looked at each other and did a double take, because the woman who'd said this to us was in fact our own neighbour, who we sort of knew in passing, but obviously didn't know that well. So I think from that point onwards, we probably made a bit more of a conscious effort to be on better terms with our neighbours. And I think once we got through those really intense periods of our girls, I have 3 daughters, my girls being in their sort of baby phases, we sort of came out of that fog and started to involve ourselves in the community a bit more. But the real change was that some other young families moved in, and we have a back lane out the back of our house, and it's sort of got that cul-de-sac vibe, because everyone can go out there, and the kids do ride up and down on their scooters, and now we do hang out with our neighbours on a Sunday afternoon, and we formed a WhatsApp group so we can get in touch with each other and sort of help each other when we need something. I was making some Anzac biscuits the other day, didn't have any golden syrup, put it on the WhatsApp group, and a neighbour was able to help me out with that. So it sort of has a bit of that old-fashioned vibe. It's the sort of neighbourhood or childhood that I remember, because I am a kid of the 70s, and I have really fond memories of just wandering the streets with my little neighbour, Claudine, who I've just recently reconnected with as well on Facebook. So it was a really sort of free and easy childhood, and I think people are really keen for that and keen to recapture that. And if coronavirus has taught us anything, it is the importance of local community. And I think what Cuthbert Clise does is that it reinforces it. There really is at the beating heart of this is a beautiful friendship between Cara, Beth and Alex, who are neighbours side by side in the street. And I think if people can take home anything from this book, it is the importance of getting to know and getting to befriend your neighbours, and also not being too quick to judge them, because I think if there's one mistake that is made in this story, it's that quickness to judge. I mean, we see what we see from the outside of someone's house, but what exactly lies beyond the picket fence, we don't really know until we stop and try to get to know someone. So that's quite a bit of talking from me. My husband is madly writing down things in the background behind the phone, so I'm hoping that these are questions.
Yeah, there's questions. There's lots of compliments, and there's definitely questions. Claire Burrows has asked, "What is your inspiration with all the cooking? ? I have to say I really enjoyed the catch-ups the women have over their glasses of wine and their meal preps."
Yes, so this was a bit of a combination of my imagination and my reality. So yeah, in the book, food is a really big topic, obviously. I mean, food, we all love food, right? But it's something that really bonds the 3 neighbours and brings them together. They're from very different walks of life. Cara is a single mum, she's a widower. Beth is a stay-at-home mum of teenage kids, and Alex is a corporate high flyer. But one thing they all have in common is this sort of love of getting together and socialising over food. Now, I'm a semi-keen foodie, so I think my interest in food has been a bit dulled by having to cook meals for my kids for the last decade, and they are really boring eaters. And my husband and I eat quite well, but now we're actually eating as a family, so I sort of cook boring food for them. But I have always had a really keen interest, particularly in baking. And it was something that my mum passed on to me. And she is a great baker. She is a great cook. She's quite an adventurous cook for a woman of her vintage. You know, she used to serve up exotic things to us like pasta carbonara, which, you know, in 1980s suburban northern beaches was sort of quite unusual. So I think I have inherited a love of an interest in cooking and food. So I hope that answers the question, Claire. Oh, and by the way, I should mention that anyone who goes to my website and signs up for my newsletter automatically gets a free copy of a booklet of recipes from Cuthbert Clise. So there's this really delicious chocolate peanut butter caramel mug cake that the women bake together, and I put that recipe into the booklet. So just go to my website, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get it in your inbox.
Yeah, well, that is an isolation special. I also had a question from Adam, or you had a question. Adam asks, what was it like writing this book as opposed to writing after the party?
That is a really good question. Writing a book, in some ways, it is like having a baby or giving birth, because it's terrible at the time, but then you sort of manage to block out the terribleness of it all. So I actually remember this book as sort of a dream. You know, I was writing something I knew well, which was Australian suburbia. I was writing about female friendships. Again, I place high store and value on my female friendships and love the complexity and the conversation and the range of topics that we cover. So it felt at the time like it was a joy to come and sit down, and I'd had that same experience with After the Party, and I think that's when you know that you're writing the right thing, is that it's enjoyable and it sort of gives you energy and you want to sit down at the computer, because you spend a lot of time. You really do have to apply that bum glue and make yourself sit in front of the computer. So for me, it has to be fun. That is a big thing for me. I have to inject that bit of humour. Of course, you know, the books do deal with some, you know, darker themes, and I like to think of it as sort of like a caramel popcorn. You know, there's sweetness, but there's a bit of chewiness there, something to really sort of think about later on. But yeah, mostly I sort of try and forget, in a way, what it felt like to write, because it can feel really hard, it can feel good, but once it's done, you do sort of tend to erase it a little bit. I feel like I've just said totally contradictory things in that, but it's a roller coaster. It's great, it's terrible, it's in between, it's all of the things, writing. Okay.
Lynn Kelly has a question. She asks, how many books have you written? So that's a short question to answer.
No, well, it's interesting. So I've had 2 books published, but I've actually written, I think I've written 4 manuscripts. So I did 2 before I got published. So I wrote 2 books, which will not ever be published because they're not terribly good, but they were amazing training for, you know, writing is a craft. It's something you need to practice a lot. You know, there's that theory of that you need to do something for 10,000 hours to become good at it. And I'm sure that applies to writing. The more you do, the better you get. So I consider those first 2 manuscripts as my training and learning novels. But what I really learned through them is, as I was just saying, that I need to have fun and I need to enjoy it, and that translates through that. I think that translates through the page. And those first 2 books were far too serious, I think, far too depressing and serious. So they weren't just quite me, I don't think. It just took me a while to find my voice and find my niche of where I wanted to be, which is sort of more in that Marion Keyes, Leanne Moriarty style, I suppose. At least that's what I'm aiming for. They are queens and goddesses, so I don't compare myself to them, but they are certainly inspirations for what I do.
Malvina Yock has asked 2 questions. She's asked a question earlier, which was, where did you get your characters from? And then she's come through late with another one, which is, who are the authors that you like to read in your downtime?
Yeah, so I think I've just mentioned Leanne Moriarty and Marion Keyes, but I actually do tend to focus on female Australian authors, and I have a lot of favourites, and whenever I'm asked this, my mind goes blank. But Some that I really do love are like Rachel Johns, who writes amazing women's fiction, Natasha Lester, who writes terrific historical fiction. There's a great new book out by Lisa Ireland called The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan, which I'm really keen to read. And I just read an incredible book called Shearwater by Leah Swan. That is one that you are definitely going to need the tissues for. It's a tough read, but it's really rewarding, so I highly recommend that. Now, in terms of my own characters, there's an adage in writing that characters are 1/3 imagination, they're 1/3 yourself, and they're 1/3 based on people you know. And that is pretty true for the kinds of women that I write. They're not all me, but they're definitely parts of me, and I always seem to write women who are mothers because that is such a fundamental part of who I am, but they're mothers plus more, because let's face it, that is the role for women these days. And this book in particular looks at the pressure on women to be financial providers to the household these days. It's not enough to just raise the kids. You're very much expected to have a job and make a contribution, and the women in my book really struggle with that, and that whole work-life balance myth that we all get thrust upon us. I guess this idea that we can do it all and we can do it all really well, that's something that the women in my book always struggle with.
Sandy Docker has come through with a great question, a very topical. How do you think Cuthbert Clise would cope with lockdown during COVID?
Oh, that is a good question. I think Cuthbert Clise would actually cope really well. I do see it very much as being similar to the neighbourhood in which I live at the moment, and generally we've all come together. So I had a situation recently where my daughter, who's a celiac, I couldn't get any gluten-free Wheat Bix, and I sort of made a joke about it online, saying, oh, ha, 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 all these people have gone and panic bought gluten-free Wheat Bix, which is actually tastes like cardboard, so have fun eating all of it. But anyway, within a couple of days, I had 4 boxes of gluten-free Wheat Bix supplied by my neighbours, and that's the kind of place I live in, and I think that is the vibe of Cuthbert Clise. Charlie Devine, who's the fish out of water, I don't know about her. She's sort of obsessed with health and fitness, and she might have a few wacky conspiracy theories about how coronavirus started, because that's sort of the kind of person she is, or actually that's the kind of person her husband is, so there is a difference there.
Neve Lysart has come through with a typically the kind of question you'd ask if you were a friend. Do people ever recognise themselves in your books? Family or friends? ?
Gosh, I don't think they do, although I was pretty upfront with a friend of ours, and Neve, you know this friend, for my first book, After the Party. The main character in that, Lisa, is based on, well, she's semi-based on a friend of ours called Amy. And I told Amy this, and I said, you know, there's a lot of Lisa in you, but you, Amy, have much better dress sense, because Lisa in that book is a bit of a frump, and Amy is this gorgeous, sparkly person who always looks fabulous. So I told her that. I don't think she was offended, but it's really helpful sometimes to have that personal reference, because when you're sitting there looking at the blinking cursor and thinking, right, well, what would this character say next? Then I can just sort of call up that personality or that particular person in my head and think, okay, well, I think Amy would say something like XYZ. But like I said, they're never 100% people that you know in real life. I mean, fiction has to be a little bit heightened, and you have to sort of operate your characters a bit like puppets. So it wouldn't work for me or for the story to have them 100% based on someone I know, and I would actually feel like it wasn't ethically correct, even if they were a wonderful character, or, you know, there's nothing controversial about them. We are still writing fiction, and I think that is important to keep in mind.
Okay, Suzanne Bowditch has a question. She wants to know where you start with plotting in your book.
Oh, Suzanne, that is a really great question. I think usually I start with a premise or a scenario. So for this, it was the idea of a new neighbour comes into town and starts to really rock the boat, and then I took it from there. But after the party, the starting point was a woman abandons her child at a kid's birthday party, and I took the story and moulded the characters and the plot around that. Recently, I read quite a lot of craft books on writing because it feels like the kind of craft that I'm never going to master, and I will always be a student of the craft. And this particular book that I've just read is called, it's by Lisa Cron, and it's called Story Genius. And she takes quite a different approach. She takes much more of a character-centered approach rather than a traditional sort of three-act style, which a lot of craft books sort of promote. But she really strips it back to why is this character in this situation? Why are they acting in the way that they do? And so it's a sort of more organic way to develop a plot. Whereas the other method, the three-act method, starts with, well, right, you have to have a big bang exciting incident, and that sets off a train of events, and then there has to be a turning point midway through where the hero feels like all is lost. I think there's room in writing for both approaches, and one of the real struggles of being a writer is figuring out which approach works for you. And I think every single writer has a different process, and it can be quite confusing because sometimes you just feel like you're doing it wrong. But there is no right and wrong. There's just the way you do it. And in fact, I heard Dervla McTiernan, who's a wonderful crime writer based in Perth, she said the only wrong way to write a book is to not write the book. So if you're an aspiring writer out there, I would say don't worry too much about methods and fitting your story to a certain structure. Just sit down in that chair and let the words flow, and then you can really work and craft and mould what you've got.
Well, a more scary question probably for you. Did you always want to be a writer?
Oh,
That's from Tracy Anderson, sorry, by the way.
Thanks, Tracy. I always wanted to be a reader, and I'll always be a reader. That's the truth. Growing up, it just didn't even occur to me that writing could be an occupation or a career, and I don't know why, because I don't know, like I must have been quite dense, or it was because I was reading writers who were English or had long since died, or it just didn't seem a practical thing for me. But the next best thing was to go into journalism. So when I was 16, I did work experience at Channel 9 on the Today Show, and I was hooked. From that moment on, I just wanted to go into TV journalism because it did seem to combine a love of story and words and storytelling, but also gave you that amazing opportunity to get out and interview people. Now, it wasn't until I hit my early 30s and had my second child that I started to think seriously about creative writing. I was at home with two very young babies. I was alone a lot of the time, as a lot of new mothers are. I really wanted something for myself and needed to use my brain in a different way other than feeding and wiping bums. So I looked into doing some creative writing studies at university, and so that was now probably about 10 to 12 years ago, I think. So it's been a real journey. It took me a long time to get that first publishing contract, but it's a wonderful job. It's a really wonderful job. You get to sit down and create and just make up stories in your head, and there are so many different things I really enjoy about writing, but it's a real task of problem solving. Writing is problem solving all the time on behalf of your characters and working out knotty plots and working out which word is going to be best or how to phrase that sentence in the best way. So it's a great mental challenge.
Well, the obvious next question then comes from Lynn Kelly, who asks, how many hours do you spend each day writing?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Now that my girls are all at school, I have 5 days a week and I have school hours. So I will usually sit down in my chair at 9 a.m. and I have to sort of sidle my way into writing. So I do spend a good half hour of faffing around on the internet and looking at emails and social media, and so almost like I have to sort of drag myself towards it because I know it's going to be hard and that the work is going to test me. But then let's say from sort of 9:30, 10 o'clock onwards, I get going, and often I'll write a sentence, 7 words, and I'll think, right, excellent. And then I'll get up and make myself a cup of tea or coffee and sort of congratulate myself for having written 1 sentence. So I really do have to warm into it. But once I really get going, the time disappears and the words do start to flow normally. I get up to have some lunch at about 1 o'clock. Then I'll hopefully get back to the computer, and I usually write my quickest and best words between 2 and 2:30 because that's in the half hour before I have to go back and get the kids. So on balance, it's probably 3 to 4 hours of writing per day. At the moment, I'm aiming to hit about 2,000 words a day, which is, for me, is the absolute maximum. And a lot of those words are probably going to be rubbish, but as the saying goes, you can't edit a blank page. You have to be able to work with something. So that's pretty much that's a standard writing day when I'm in the thick of creating that first draft. I mean, not all days are like that, but just at the moment, that is what my writing life looks like.
So Hanadi Nasser asks another question. It's probably a bit of a hypothetical, but if your books ever got adapted to TV, would you fight for them to stay set in Australia?
Oh, Hanadi, that is an excellent question, and look, not something I've thought about seriously, I have to say. That would be a dream scenario for them to be adapted. I have mixed feelings. So more often than not, I don't like books to be adapted and taken into a different country. But, you know, with Big Little Lies, for example, it really actually sort of worked. I was quite surprised by how successful that adaptation was. I mean, I adored that book and I loved the setting in Australia and really wondered how they were going to translate it. But Reese Witherspoon, who bought the rights, I mean, she's a really smart lady. So she knew where to set it in America to sort of capture that vibe that Leanne Moriarty had in the book. So look, I think it can be done, but it takes a really smart producer, writer, cast to pull it off and not lose that unique flavour that initially drew people to the work.
I think we've got time for one more question with 3 minutes to go. So Claire Burrows asked another one. Any good questions or topics that you would raise as a book club session about this book?
Oh, gosh, Claire, you've put me on the spot, but that is a good question. I suppose the questions I enjoy with book clubs, I think, is discussing character motivations and why they do what they do, and also delving a bit below to see why the authors make the choices that they do. I think book clubs are great because people have different opinions, but it shouldn't just be on that surface level of I liked blah blah or I liked blah blah, but really trying to drill down into the issues, I suppose, that the book raises. So I think with this book, one of the key questions it asks is about the expectations and the pressures that women put on themselves and that are also put upon them by society. So I would love, because book clubs are full of women, I think that would be a really interesting discussion and a sort of natural stepping off point for what's raised in Cuthbert Clise.
So 30 seconds to go. One last question. Malvina Yock comes again. What's next for you?
Oh, thank you.
30 seconds.
That's a good question. Okay, I'll talk quickly. So, as I said, I am in the middle of writing another book, but I've also just finished the draft of my third book, which hopefully, fingers crossed, will be published around, I don't know, sometime in 2021. So that book has a working title of Out of the Ashes. It looks a bit more at the media and incorporates some of the experiences and feelings that I had working as a journalist in my 20s in very male-dominated, chauvinistic sort of newsrooms. So that hopefully will be on the shelves next year, and hopefully a few more books after that. I think we've come to the end. My half hour is up. Thank you again to Better Reading. Thank you to everyone who joined in and asked questions. I really appreciate them. Many thanks for the support. This has not been the launch I thought it would be, but in some ways it's been even more amazing, and I really do appreciate the support. Thank you.